Well, I think that the rejection, in some sense, of the travails of the saints and the prophets and the crucifix is definitely, it's rejection of the catastrophe of mortality. Because all of those traditions call on us, and you see this as a clinician. One of the things that clinicians learned across all the different schools of clinical psychology was that the more radically you accept the necessity of confronting what you're terrified of and wish to avoid, the higher the probability that you'll move forward and recover. And we don't know the limit to that, right? And the Christian question, in some real sense, is the limit to that. It's like, well, how deep into the abyss do you have to look? And the answer is not only into death, but beyond death, into hell. Because if death is what terrifies you the most, you know nothing about hell, because there are many things worse than death. And so the call is to gaze into the abyss as far down as it goes, and that's all the way to the bottom.
But that basic state of vulnerability, of fragility, it does conjure up a sense of finitude, I think, in the human experience. Finitude and dependence, and a sense of lack, a sense that we are not, in the end, masters and captains of our soul, that we require an orientation to something greater, something on which we do depend.
Finite,
yeah, absolutely.
And also, I think we have a particular crisis at the moment. I think we can see this in the universities with the so-called mental health crisis. And it's linked to this assumption that human beings should be happy. And if they're not, there's something wrong with them. And our ancestors grew up with the tenet that life is extremely difficult, and that a path to happiness is extremely demanding.
And also unbelievably unlikely, right? And you should be grateful when it comes along, but by no means expect it. And then they had a noble vision too on the Roman and the Greek and the Hebrew front, which was not so much hedonic happiness, which is very trivial. And Solzhenitsyn says, well, that disappears when you first hear the boots kicking down your door at 3 a.m. It's like, so much for happiness, that's gone. And then what do you have? And well, that was Frankl's question and Solzhenitsyn's question. And part of the answer to that is, in the face of privation and terror and tragedy and malevolence, you have the great adventure of your life. And one of the things that I think is true is that you find that adventure in truth. Because truth is an adventure, and it might be enough of an adventure. It might be enough of an adventure to justify the catastrophe and malevolence of life.
And I wonder whether the erosion of certain basic rituals is also generating a lot of problems. I mean, not trivial example, but one that comes to my mind was a death in college about 20 years ago of a brilliant young student who was hit by a car crossing the road in college. And I noticed that the students, the 18, 19-year-old students, were completely thrown by this. And partly it emerged they hadn't been to funerals. Their parents hadn't taken them along to funerals.
Right, to shelter them.
To protect them from suffering. And they'd say, as good parents, they would not allow their children to be subjected to funerals as if the funerals might be damaging them. Now, what I noticed was, in fact, that you had adults, young adults, highly intelligent adults, who were completely disorientated and distraught by death. And I think to some extent because the ritual of funerals...
Well, there's no container for it. Well, my wife remembers when she was 5, her grandfather died and they didn't take her to the funeral. Now, my wife's parents, by the way, were very good at fostering independence, but they didn't take her to the funeral. And she was shocked by that and never forgot it. And I think the reason is that the message there is that death itself is so terrifying that there's no way a child can apprehend it or bear up under it. And that better not be the case, because that's life, death. And so if that's the case, then life is too much. And so what you do is you bring the child to the funeral to show that. So when my wife's mother died, we were there for her death. And it was a terrible death. She had a neurological disease, a degenerative neurological disease, dementia. So she deteriorated over about 15 years. And first of all, her husband rose to the challenge. Man, it was something to see. Because he was sort of a man about town, but when the chips were down, God, he was there. And it was something, man. And then I watched her family deal with this. They're pretty tough. My wife's sister is a palliative care nurse, and her other sister is a pharmacist. And they've confronted mortality, in a noble sense. And what happened in that family was that as they mutually faced death together, and this is also what you do at a funeral, is the bonds that attached them to each other grew stronger and thicker. And so that while they suffered the loss of their mother, which was a genuine loss, they were compensated for it in a real sense by the increase in love between them. And I would say their family, in the aftermath of their mother's death, was much closer and tighter than it was before. And, you can't say, well, that made it good, because that's a cheap out, but you can bloody well say that it made it a lot less like hell than it had to be. And so these containing rituals, your children are a lot tougher than people think, and you need to take them to a funeral so that they can see that the adults, I'm going to be like Dad, and look, he can stand up in the face of death, maybe even in the face of the death of his father, and he can still move forward. And God, you better learn that, because it's coming down the pipelines.
But the text is, this text is precisely such a ritual, right? This isn't a live stream of history, right? This is a text written to convey, you might say, the order in history, or the transcendent order in history, and to bring us into that history. And so, when you talk about the ritual of the funeral, for example, that's a ritual to help you understand the horror of death, and to, in some sense, redeem it, at least from the point of view of your own self-consciousness, to be able to understand it. And so I think, when you see these moments that refer to God remembering his covenant and so on, this is in a way showing us that the text is itself a liturgical creation of our own subjectivity, our own memories, such that we can make sense of our lives here and now.
Well, I just want to ask Jordan a question. It intrigued me what you said about your mother's father. It was bon vivant, and then rose to the challenge.
Oh man, it was unreal.
Right. So I want to ask you a question. Prior to the challenge, what would you have predicted his behavior would have been?
Well, I always liked him and admired him, but he was a man about town, extroverted guy.
So he passed the test, and you would have predicted he would have passed the test.
Not to the degree that he did. It was really quite stunning.
So here's my question, and it's really, I wrestle with it. I don't have an answer. I am curious to hear anyone on this. Do we know people before they have been tested?
No, not really. We don't know ourselves either.
Then this is a very, very interesting question, because life in America, at least, from World War II to the last, till 2010 even years ago, was quite easy for the vast majority of its citizens.
Mm-hmm. By any reasonable historical standard.
Exactly, yeah, which is the only standard, obviously. So, is it fair to say we don't know the moral caliber of most of the people living in America, because I think people have been tested in the last 2 years, and I think half of my fellow citizens failed dismally, especially doctors, I might add.
Well, wasn't it Hemingway who said that every generation needs a war to sort out what's important? And
it's a very dark thought.
Yes. Well, it's maybe, William James would have said something like a war or its moral equivalent. And that was something James...
Right, or its moral equivalent.
Yeah, well, because you have...
Well, that's what I'm referring to, its moral equivalent, yes.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Well,
so it's interesting, do we even know ourselves till we're tested?
Mm-hmm. I don't think so. Well, I think you can make a case for this biologically. Here's a case. This is quite interesting. So you might ask, why do you grow when you go somewhere new? And there's two answers to that. One is you go there and you gather more information, you talk to new people, you see new things. And so you can think about that as a constructivist response, right? Your web of knowledge, adaptive knowledge increases because you've been more places. But that's not all that happens. If you go somewhere new and you expose yourself to a challenge, then new genes, the genes that haven't turned on to encode certain proteins, turn on, and they flesh out your psychophysiological structure. And you could even imagine that you decided to take on a new challenge voluntarily. So that'd be part of the heroic journey. Then your biology is going to respond to that right down to the genetic level. And it's going to reveal new potential that's coded inside the genetic structure that's going to make you literally more than you are. And there's this idea that Jung talked about in relationship to the maze in the Chartres Cathedral. So imagine you go into this maze, and then you walk the 4 quadrants, and then you come to the center. And the 4 quadrants are the 4 corners of the world. And you have to pass through all the 4 corners of the world before you come to the center. And the idea there is that you have to hit yourself against all the sharp edges of the world before the full potential of what you are is manifest. And that has something to do, I would say, also with the idea of the harrowing of hell, is that you have to face death, and you have to face tyranny, and you have to face malevolence, and so that's hell at that point. And the deeper you peer into that abyss, and the more strenuously you wrestle with that, the more of you turns on. And so, and I think that's how, and then you also think, well, how could it be any other way? Why would what was within you manifest itself fully in the absence of challenge? Nothing works that way. You don't get stronger without lifting weights.
So then that leads to another question. How many people, putting aside an easy society, how many people lead a life devoid of challenges?
Well,
pretty small. They just don't acknowledge them as challenges, and therefore don't need to pass the test.
Well, or they're resentful and bitter about their problems instead of seeing them as adventures and opportunities.
That's the age we live in.
Yeah.
If I'm challenged, it's the fault of someone.
Yeah. Well, and people are enticed to believe that. But what I've been so heartened by, and one of the things that people have been responding to in relationship to what I've been lecturing about as a clinician, I would say, is when you confront young people, this has especially been true of young men, with the notion that what they should do is strive to bear up underneath the heaviest responsibility they can shoulder voluntarily. They're unbelievably receptive to that idea. And it's so interesting to watch, because it's almost as if all you have to do is introduce the idea, assuming you're vaguely credible. All you have to do is introduce the idea, and it's like a crystal in a supersaturated solution. It just goes, no one ever told me that. And one of the things that's been deeply sorrowful for me is to see how much effect those ideas have on people, how quickly. And the reason it's sorrowful is because you simultaneously see how much of a lack there is of that idea in our current culture. So, but I think people are there for the call, man, and lots of them, especially young people on that sort of cusp of messianic development in late adolescence, when the radicals can get a hold of them and make them resentful and bitter. If you offer a better pathway forward, which is something like bear up voluntarily under the catastrophe of life because you have something to offer, right? There's this idea, in the biblical idea, that in some sense, God says this, I think he says it to Moses later, that maybe it's in the Gospels, that it's required that all of the ramifications of the law manifest themselves. It's like a holy requirement. And the idea there is something like, and this is a really terrifying metaphysical idea. It's like, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there malevolence in the world? Well, maybe it's because we're not all we could be. And maybe it's incumbent on each of us, and I really mean each of us, to reveal everything that is within us. And if we revealed everything that was within us, and that would happen as a consequence of this voluntary ethical striving, if we revealed everything within us, God only knows how much hell we could dispense with. Because we have no idea what things could be like if everyone was 100% aiming up.
This might be, forgive me for, I just want to say this is so important, I think. So I remember in high school, I started an anti-cheating campaign in my grade. And I remember vividly this is really triggering things in me. The biggest reason I had cheated on some tests in elementary school. But the biggest reason I didn't in high school was God was not particularly involved in my decision, which he would have been more so later in moral decisions. I wanted to pass the test of not cheating.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm just thinking, literally for the first time, maybe that's another good method of getting people to do what is good. Pass tests. Mm-hmm. Pass challenges.
Yeah, well, there is speculation. Yes. There's this, obviously, this scene in Job where God bets with the devil, which is a hell of a thing to do. It's like you're going to bet with the devil, and the idea is that you can tempt Job out of his moral position. And what's God up to? And I had a vision about that at one time, about God presenting man with the most vicious adversary possible. And you might think, well, why would someone do that? And the answer is something like, well, if you know that the entity that you're setting the forces of hell against, in some real sense, can triumph over that, then the positioning of the adversary is actually a call to a greater good. And I think, I can't help but think that that's correct, because I can't see how what is best can be called out of us without us being confronted simultaneously by what is worst.
But I hope I'm not being biased by saying that's important, but it's a kind of mid-level test of growth. So you've mentioned responsibility, or reaching our full potential of who we are. You can do that in various ways, but many of them are truly, some self-help goes some way towards that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think what you see here, the call of Moses or the call of Abraham or the call of lots of people in the scripture, the highest responsibility of all is responding in faith to God's call.
Mm-hmm, right. By definition.
By definition, the highest fulfillment. I actually dislike my own name intensely, but I was named after a writer whose most famous book is called My Utmost for His Highest.
Right.
And that's
right.
What
that's the
saying.
proper
That's
call
calling.
of the church.
That's calling.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I don't think there's any higher.
You've written a book on calling.
Any higher version of that.
Well, and here's something that's relevant to that too. So I know neuropharmacologically, I studied pleasure as a biological mechanism, and the intense pleasure that's associated with joy and enthusiasm. So enthusiasm is to be filled with God, theos, and theos. It's to be filled with the Spirit of God. You do not experience joy as a consequence of achieving a goal. You experience joy as a consequence of positing a goal and then noting progress towards the goal. And so a corollary of that is that the higher the goal, the more intense the joy attendant on observation of progress towards it. And so then you might say, if you wanted to maximize the possibility of hedonic expression, not to degenerate into a cheap hedonism, but to maximize it in the most real sense, and this is a Viktor Frankl idea in some fundamental senses, you pick the most noble possible goal. And that's the mountain, that's service to God, again, by definition, right? Because it's service to the highest thing, whatever that is. And then that opens the door, that does literally open the door to it's a precondition for the experience of joy. And so these people who are depressed and anxious and miserable, part of the reason for that is that their ethic is scattered. Their goals are diverse and low level. There's nothing beckoning in the distance. And so they can't see progress because there's no progress, and certainly not progress to a superordinate goal. So there's actually no positive emotion. And that's technically the case because the positive emotion system is a calibration system that produces navigation orientation towards a destination point. That's literally how it functions. So
I think you just described the whole book of Exodus just right there. Like that's
right.
Really what Exodus is.
Right. Well, that's
like
the journey
the
to
scattered,
the promised land.
mixed multitude that is gathered into, and you can experience that in yourself as much as in a people or in anything. Actually, functions that way.
And that
Anything
is
you can identify.
where there is no vision of people perishing.
Right,
where,
exactly.
Where the cultural norms are so degraded.
It's also the danger of dispensing with an ideal, because the problem with ideals is that every ideal is a judge. So the ideal of beauty is a judge because who of us compares to the ideal beauty? And the answer is no one, and we all know it. And so the ideal is a catastrophe in that sense.
It's a raging fire that can consume you.
Yes, exactly. But if there's no ideal, there's no goal. And if there's no goal, then there's no joy. And so what are we going to do? We're going to dispense with our ideals so we don't hurt anybody's feelings? And what we're going to dispense, well, that's exactly what we're being called upon to do. And so we're going to abandon joy, and unless you have the ultimately judgmental ideal. It's so perverse. Unless you have the ultimately judgmental ideal, there's no precondition for joy.
But back to Stephen's thing about the funeral and the reality, the history. In other words, psychology and lots of things, you can throw incredible interpretive light. But the highest thing here is that God is the actor in this, and it happens in history. So the surrounding nations, all their festivals were festivals of nature, spring and so on. The Jewish festivals are festivals of history, and they're taught to follow them as if they were... there, maybe centuries later. In other words, you've got to keep always that history is the decisive thing here, and in light of history, you bring in psychology. I happen to be trained sociology, bring it in. But history and meeting God, you're into pretty heavy philosophy. Yeah.
You see here, too, that what's put in the highest place, which is so fascinating, is the spirit that calls you to freedom out of tyranny, right, as we said before, even if it calls you into the desert to begin with. And so it's quite the conceptualization of God, is that part of whatever is to be properly put in the highest place is exactly the spirit that